Hi Julia, tell me what you've been reading this week.
Hey Laura, I've spent a lot of time this week reading about what's happening with the meat industry in the US as a result of coronavirus. Loads and loads of coverage in the US media at the moment and some of the UK media as well. An article that I found really helpful actually was in Time magazine by Tara Law, which just provided a really simple overview of what's happening there. And, the kind of things that caught my eye around this is this is a situation that's really coming to a crisis point now with Tyson Foods, one of the biggest meat producers in the US, taking out a full-page ad in the New York Times this week to warn that the food supply chain is breaking. This is all linked to workers at meat processing plants testing positive for COVID-19 and those plants being shut down, and that having huge impact on meat supply chains and both and up and down the supply chain. So that's definitely, I think, a really interesting article that provides a really good overview of some of the questions that I think are going to come out of that whole crisis, questions that aren't just relevant for the US, but also over here about, levels of consolidation in the meat industry, the reliance on human labor and the need for, automation and mechanization, and so on and so forth.
And I know this word's used quite heavily, but it is pretty unprecedented, isn't it, for a meat company to be taking advertising space like that in national press?
Totally, and I think it just speaks to the situation they are finding themselves in,
Mm.
where on the one hand you had Donald Trump signing an executive order earlier this week saying the meat industry is an essential industry and trying to keep meat processing plants in operation, but of course those companies have a duty of care to their workers as well. And need to find a way for those workers to operate safely and with the right protective equipment. So yeah, it's as you say, it's an unprecedented situation that isn't just causing prices to spike and is potentially going to result in less choice on supermarket shelves, but I think is also going to be a catalyst for wider debate about the shape and health of the meat sector and how it might need to change post-COVID.
Yeah. The first thing that I saw this week that caught my eye was a stat released by the British Frozen Food Federation. And this was the fact that we're buying more frozen food. And I know that's not a surprise to any of us, but 28% up the frozen food category. But what really was interested in that article was the fact that the UK consumers still don't really know what they're doing with frozen food in terms of how long do items take to defrost? Should you be putting them on a sunny window ledge, or should you be putting them in the fridge? And how much actually the food industry still has an opportunity to go back to basics with educating, or just actually in a more modern way supporting consumers with how they can use frozen food. And Iceland, I guess, have really revolutionised a lot of the frozen food category and are leading the charge in some of this. So yeah, really caught my eye and thinking, could this be a trend that would stay in the UK market, that we're actually going to continue to buy more frozen product?
I think it's an interesting point, and I think there was an article actually on BBC Future this week as well, sort of talking about, I guess, some of the misconceptions that still exist around, how healthy frozen is versus fresh, how nutritious it is. So yeah, as you say, it feels like there's quite a lot of progress that's already been made, and there should be an opportunity here for the industry to use the fact that sales are up, more people are buying more frozen products and are, interested in learning how best to use them, to use that as a springboard to, educate them and try and, dispel some of the myths that still exist around frozen.
Yeah. What was the second thing that caught your eye this week that you've been reading?
So the second thing was this really great article about online grocery shopping and the carbon footprint specifically associated with online grocery shopping versus going to a store. And this is from Grist. Grist is an online publication, a US online publication that does quite a bit of investigative and explainer journalism around sustainability and the environment. And this is a piece by Maddie Stone, which was really prompted by the annual letter by Jeff Bezos to Amazon shareholders. He writes this letter every year, and it's always picked apart and analysed for sort of clues as to the future direction of Amazon. And this year it talks a lot about Amazon's response to COVID-19, of course, but it contains this really interesting snippet that caught Maddie's eye, and she used it as a sort of starting point for her article. And I'll just read you what he wrote. So the context here is that Amazon has been doing some of its own research trying to quantify the carbon footprint associated with shopping online versus a car journey going to a store. And what he says is the study found that averaged across all basket sizes, online grocery deliveries generate 43% lower carbon emissions per item compared to shopping in stores. And smaller basket sizes generate even greater carbon savings. That's quite an interesting claim, and they base this on shopping with Whole Foods Market, which is obviously owned by Amazon. And what the article in Grist has done is really ran this through a bit of a fact check, and they spoke to some experts to see, does 43% sound likely, and what might be some of the uncertainties or variance in a figure like that. And what's sort of come through, which I think is sort of speaks to the wider problem of sort of deciding what is environmentally friendly and what isn't environmentally friendly, is that quite a few of the experts they spoke to thought 43% roughly sounds about right in terms of the ballpark, or at least was plausible, but that it really does come down to the specific situation you are in. On average 43% lower doesn't really tell you that much about whether it would be more environmentally friendly for your specific situation. And they quoted one scientist in particular who said that it kind of depends on what your normal shopping behavior is already. So, if you're already walking, biking, or driving a Tesla, as he put it, to the grocery store, then switching to online grocery is probably going to, make your carbon footprint go up. So it really, depends on your particular situation. And sort of, I think, really illustrates some of the dangers in making these broad brushstroke comparisons or statements about how environmentally friendly something is.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And Amazon, I know that they've been threatening to come into the UK food market or anticipate more than just Whole Foods for quite some time. So interesting if they're putting a bit of a marker down there to help differentiate themselves, and not only obviously in the UK but worldwide. Do you think we'll see them in the UK market soon?
I mean, they've obviously got a decent presence in the UK market already. Obviously grocery is still relatively small compared with the sort of wider offering that they have. But yeah, I think I think they have demonstrated that they have a clear appetite for doing something quite ambitious around grocery. And Amazon, I think one of the reasons Amazon has been so challenging for some of the more traditional retailers to deal with is that they have this real culture and appetite for experimentation. Yeah, I think what the actual size of their grocery operation will end up being, I think, is almost impossible to tell. But I think they have shown consistent interest and a consistent willingness to invest some money and run some pretty eye-catching experiments in that area. So yeah, I don't think anyone ever feels that they can't take them seriously, no matter which sector they are in. But, you know, I think that whole piece around the environmental footprint, that's obviously a really live topic for Amazon, full stop. But I think it's also just symptomatic of some of the debate around sustainability, where you want to be able to give people guidance and say this would be a good choice or better choice, and this would be a worse choice. And sometimes it's just so difficult to do that when the arguments you know, are so nuanced, and you know, it's so difficult to say, well, in your specific situation and in this particular set of circumstances, you know, online grocery would be more or less environmentally friendly. So for me, that piece, I think, was just a useful reminder of how tricky and complex these debates about sustainability tend to be.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But the second thing that I wanted to talk about was an article that I really enjoyed reading this week in the Telegraph by Mary Portas, the retail guru, and she was chatting about what the future landscape of retail was going to look like out of the grocery sector for a change for us. And we know the high street's been under pressure for a long time, and COVID's going to fast track some of that change, and particularly off the back of the news this week that John Lewis is being quite open about the fact it's probably not going to open all of its stores back up once we get back into normal habits. But what Mary Portas was saying, that what will be left after we pass COVID is a more experiential retail experience or environment. So as you say, you know, we're so used to shopping online now. If you're going out your house to go to a department store or whatever it may be, it's got to offer something really different. And the market's actually been crying out for that for a long time, but this is going to fast track us a decade in terms of what that looks like. What that she's actually anticipating it will look like is probably a lot less choice, particularly in the short term. So quantity will disappear, but quality will increase. So, and I suppose with that as well, price point. So, you know, watching with interest what's happening with Primark at the moment, with no online offering whatsoever and all their stores closed. Will that discount end of the market still be there, or will it be a more premium experience type of environment that we're used to when we go out onto the high street? So I was watching some Kantar stats this morning, and they were saying that only 35% of people are looking forward to go back shopping as an experience. But I thought it'd be higher than that, because that's my hobby. So that's how sad my life is. So I'm keen to get back out there and see what the high street's doing in terms of that sort of fashion retail environment, and it'd be very interesting to see who comes and who moves quickly in that space as well.
Totally. I mean, I think with experiential, it feels like that is a trend that's been talked about quite a lot and for such a long time. And I find when, you know, people pitch stories to me or want to talk to me about experiential, it's such a broad term. I'm still not entirely sure what it is in practice. You know, I think you can see quite a lot of experiential elements in various sort of retail environments, but yeah, I'm not quite sure we've fully cracked the added value that provides to shoppers beyond a little bit of distraction here and there. So, you know, I think it's really interesting to see Mary Porter's believe so strongly in this being the point of difference that is going to you know, help ensure that the high street continues to thrive. But particularly I think in food, you know, we've seen quite a few attempts to bring more experiential components to retailing. How effective those have been when it really comes to, you know, persuading shoppers to spend more time in stores and spend a bit more money, I don't know. I do wonder how quickly after COVID, after the lockdown, after, you know, social physical distancing, shoppers are going to have an appetite to be in some kind of retail experience, or whether we're going to want something reasonably, you know, transactional at the beginning. But it'll be fascinating to watch, I think.
You're totally right. And when you think of experiential, and you're right, you know, there isn't a huge amount of it. You think expensive, you think people, you think labour, you think personal shopper, or something like that. And you're right, in the grocery, you know, be that Market Street and Morrison's, for argument's sake, and their food theatre, you're relying on having that labour, that expertise, and that's hard, isn't it, to keep that service level at I don't know, a rate that consumers are willing to pay for, and that's going to have to be passed on.
Totally.
I'll stop rambling. Tell me what your third one is.
So the third one, I read this morning, and this is like probably one of my favorite articles I've read this week. This is brilliant. It's by Amelia Tate, writing for Wired, and it's called "YouTube's Candy King is Running a Sugary Online Cartel." Brilliant headline already. It tells you what you're in for. This is the story of Edward from Arizona, and Edward is a candy selling influencer. And the way the article pitches what Edward does and who he is as follows. Every school has that one kid who tries to make money by selling sweets and drinks. Now there's an online community sharing tips and tricks for maximizing profits. So Edward, who runs hashtag Candy Cartel, and has an Instagram account called Rich Snack Seller, basically specializes in providing tips and tricks for kids that want to sell candy and hustle hard. So he's got lots of YouTube subscribers, lots of Instagram followers, mainly boys aged 13 to 18, who want to get better at selling candy at school. And it's such a it's brilliantly written, really paints a picture of Edward and his business. But it's also just one of those great ideas where you kind of think, I can't believe there's candy selling influencers now who do online mentoring and online courses on how to, maximize your profit and your, I don't know, shopping strategies for Costco to make sure your margins are good, and how to deal with teachers. There's a brilliant line in here where Edward advises kids to behave well and get good grades so that teachers are more lenient if and when they get caught selling candy. So he's got some really, hands-on advice for his audience. But yeah, as I said, I think it's just a super colorful piece, really fun, but also shows you that sort of, that influencer culture really is everywhere. When you think, surely there's not going to be a business to be made around advising kids on selling candy. Well, of course there is, and of course there's an online community around it, and of course there are influencers providing mentoring and tips. It's a really, really fun read.
I love it. Does he give the current market rate on cola cubes? That's what I'd be interested in.
He doesn't. I'm sure he keeps all of that close to his chest.
Yeah, he doesn't want to shift to a cartel, doesn't give any pricing info.
Exactly.
The last thing that I wanted to mention, again, was back onto high street and fashion retail, and something that caught my eye a couple of weeks ago that was teased in the Sunday Times and then has happened this week, was the possibility of Oasis warehouse retail chains going into administration. That Deloitte has been looking for a buyer for them for the last fortnight and announced earlier this week that hasn't been successful for their retail estate anyway. There is some interest around their brand and online sales. Why this really caught my eye is probably I've spent a lot of cash in those shops historically, but also the fact that 92 stores, standalone stores, and 437 concessions and almost 2,000 employees, and it's hardly had any news coverage. And I think this is the fact, the whole industry is changing and retail is changing. That would have probably been top second item in the news 2-3 months ago, but now it's barely even a footnote. We're going to step back out into both grocery and a standard high street retail in a few months' time, and it's going to look pretty much unrecognisable, I think. But with some of these changes, so that was something that I just more so the lack of news coverage around it really did catch my eye.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I find, particularly with news coverage at the moment, often it's not even that there's a lack of news coverage, it's just that there is so much material at the moment. The news cycle is so fast that by the time something like that gets reported, there's so much other stuff that's happened that, it just gets drowned out a little bit at the moment. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, it feels like the changes that are happening on the high street, not just with some of these big chains that,
Yeah.
obviously everyone knows and expects to see on their high street, but also with, pubs and restaurants and, the sorts of local businesses that really do make a high street and give it its character. We're sort of living in isolation at the moment, not going to these high streets, and we're going to return at some point having to find out if our favorite restaurant is
Yeah.
managed to survive, and if our favorite pub is still going. So yeah, it's quite eerie, I think,
Mm.
at times. And those, especially some of those smaller businesses, obviously are having a really really tough time. But yeah, I think we're going to emerge out of all of this into quite a different world, not just on the high street, but elsewhere as well.
So thank you. Great to talk to you, and
You too.
catch up next week. Bye.
Bye.